In a living room in southern Ontario, sometime in the late 1960s, a teak cabinet sat against the wall on a cantilevered aluminum base. Roll the top back and the controls appeared, laid out like an instrument panel. Across the front, 6 letters. On a retail shelf today sits a cardboard carton holding a record player that costs about $120. Across the front, the same 6 letters. They are not the same company. The chain of ownership between them is legal, documented, and complete. On the first day of 2008, the Kitchener firm that had built the first one handed over its last significant asset. Not a factory, not a patent. The name. What happened in between is not the story most people assume. The company did not go bankrupt. It was not simply overrun by cheaper imports from across the Pacific. Its central skill, the thing it had done better than almost anyone in Canada for 80 years, was made worthless by a rule about where 2 loudspeakers have to sit. Company lore says the meaning of the name began with a coin. This channel is a record of the Canadian names that once stood in Canadian living rooms. The speakers, the amplifiers, the turntables, and the factories behind them. If that's your kind of history, subscribing helps these companies stay findable. Corrections in the comments are welcome. They usually make the next one better. Now the coin, 1907. Arthur Bell Pollock stood in front of his wife with a coin in his hand. Heads meant staying in Berlin, Ontario, and taking a chance on machines that played recorded sound. Tails meant heading west, most likely into real estate. Company lore, still repeated today by the brand's current owner, says the coin came up heads. Pollock had returned from New York with the rights to a hornless phonograph, acquired from Herman Schroeder, one of several inventors competing in a market Thomas Edison had opened and did not control. The paperwork mattered less than the design. A hornless phonograph did away with the flared brass trumpet that jutted out of every earlier machine and folded the acoustic amplifier inward into the wood of the cabinet itself. That one decision set the terms for the next 80 years. A phonograph with a horn was equipment. It announced itself, it sat on a table, and it looked like laboratory apparatus that had wandered into a parlor by mistake. A phonograph without one was something else entirely. It was furniture. It could be stained, matched, polished, and placed. It could be sold to Canadians who had no interest at all in acoustics, and every interest in what the front room looked like. In practice, that meant something specific in a country this size. A machine that looked like a machine had to be justified. A machine that looked like a sideboard did not. In towns strung out along the rail lines of Ontario and the prairies, where a household might order most of its goods from a catalog and wait, the phonograph arrived as the first piece of furniture that could also fill a room with an orchestra. To build it, Pollock needed an engineer. In 1909, he found one in Alex Welker, and together they established the Pollock Manufacturing Company. Later accounts date the firm variously to the first machines or to the partnership. The machines came first. Records credit it with the first phonographs manufactured in Canada. Wood followed almost immediately, and it kept following. The company acquired a woodworking plant in Elmira for the sole purpose of building phonograph cabinets. A firm that sold sound was now also permanently a firm that worked in hardwood. In 1916, with the war on, the town changed its name. Berlin became Kitchener. The company stayed where it was. The following year brought a second entity. The Phonola Company of Canada was formed to carry on phonograph assembly and the record business, while Pollock Manufacturing continued to turn out parts and metal products. That arrangement is worth reading carefully, because it explains a great deal of what came afterward. Before this company built a radio, before it built a television, before it built a screen for a coin-operated game, it built cabinets, and it dealt in records. It was in the furniture business, and it was in the music business. The electronics were the thing in the middle, the part that joined the two, and in the end, the part that proved easiest to source from somebody else. By the 1920s, the company had spread out in every direction the decade allowed. Records, radios, furniture, electric fans, in volumes that available accounts describe as the largest of any Canadian maker. Sound had been the way in. It was no longer the boundary. In 1933, the corporate name changed to Dominion Electrohome Industries Limited, and with it came a brand name meant to sit on the products themselves. Electrohome. It is worth pausing on what that word was for, because almost everything that follows turns on it. Electrohome was not the name of a loudspeaker company. It was not the name of a manufacturer with a reputation to protect among people who cared about sound. It was a merchandising label, electric and home, and it went on space heaters and food mixers as readily as it went on anything that played music. The company organized itself accordingly into three manufacturing divisions: radio and communications, appliances and metal products, furniture and woodworking. Arthur Pollock's son Carl came in as general manager of the reorganized firm. Read the list again. Two of the three divisions had nothing to do with electronics, so the name arrived in the world as a sticker before it ever arrived as a reputation. That is not a criticism of it. In 1933, in the depths of a decade when Canadian households were buying almost nothing, a label that could travel across a heater, a fan, a cabinet, and a radio was a reasonable piece of business. It just means the name was designed from the beginning to be portable, to be applied to things rather than to describe who had made them. Then the war came, and the company stopped making almost anything for civilians. The change was not gradual. Company accounts put nearly the whole of its wartime output at the service of the war effort. The work divided along the lines the company already knew. From the woodworking side came aircraft components built in wood, wings among them. From the metal side came munitions parts. From the radio side came communications equipment, including a transmitter built for the Royal Canadian Air Force. That combination did something no peacetime market would have done. A furniture manufacturer that also built radios was, in ordinary times, a slightly odd company. Under wartime contracts, it was exactly the right shape. Precision woodwork held to aircraft tolerances at one end of the building, and transmitters built to military specification at the other. The contracts also paid for tooling the firm could never have justified on fans and phonographs. When peacetime came, the company emerged with roughly 1,400 employees, machinery it had not owned in 1939, and a workforce that had spent 6 years being held to standards no living room product had ever demanded. By 1945, the firm was no longer a regional cabinet shop that happened to sell radios. Available accounts describe a company now widely regarded as a serious national manufacturer. The war left two capabilities under one roof. The company could shape wood, and it could build a receiver. In 1949, Canadian living rooms were about to need both at the same time. The company began building and selling television sets in 1949, which was 3 years before there was anything Canadian to watch. Canadian television broadcasting did not begin until 1952. In practice, that meant the earliest sets sold in southern Ontario were bought to pull in American stations reaching across the lakes. A television bought in Kitchener was, for a while, a device for watching somebody else's country. Electrohome sold them anyway. And it sold them against opponents considerably larger than itself. Northern Electric and Canadian General Electric were both in the market, both with national reach, both with engineering resources a Kitchener firm could not match. What Electrohome had was the cabinet. A console television, in the vocabulary of the period, was not a box on legs. It was a floor-standing piece of furniture with a picture tube built into it, and it was bought the way furniture is bought, by finish, by proportion, by whether it suited the room it would occupy for the next 15 years. The company built its reputation on large console models in cases of real hardwood, at a moment when a good many competitors were learning how much cheaper veneer over composite could be. That was the whole competitive position, and it was a strong one. Two households, looking at two television sets in 1953, were not comparing line resolution. Neither set had much of it. They were comparing two objects that would stand against the wall of the front room, visible from the doorway, for longer than most cars of the period lasted. The one that looked like it belonged there won. In 1951, Carl Arthur Pollock replaced his father as president. Accounts of his tenure credit him with restructuring a firm that had outgrown its own organization, and with presiding over the most successful years in its history. The timing helped. Company accounts describe the post-war population boom driving a surge in housing construction, and with it, a steady rise in demand for consumer goods, television and stereo hi-fi among them. New subdivisions were going up around every Canadian city of any size, and each new house contained a front room that was, on the day the keys changed hands, completely empty. A company that made both the furniture and the electronics was unusually well placed to fill it. 3 years after Carl Pollock took the president's chair, the company did something no other set manufacturer in the country had done. In 1954, it joined with the famous Players Theatre chain to launch CKO-TV, the first television station in Kitchener-Waterloo, operating as a CBC affiliate. The partnership put a manufacturer and a national cinema chain on the same license, one side knowing how to build receivers, the other knowing how to sell an audience a seat in front of a screen. In 1964, the station joined CTV, written down as a line in a corporate history that reads like diversification. It was stranger than that. The same company now manufactured the receiver standing in the living room and owned the transmitter feeding it. A household in Waterloo County could buy an Electrohome television, tune it to the local channel, and watch a signal the same corporation had put into the air. Very few manufacturers anywhere have held both ends of that chain at the same time. None of the others were in Kitchener. Through the 1960s, the catalog widened until it covered most of what a Canadian household could plug in and listen to: organs, radios, console stereos, loudspeakers, high-fidelity tube amplifiers, televisions. And in the mid-1960s, the first color television sets manufactured in Canada. Sources differ on the exact year. The priority itself is not in dispute. The furniture side had by this point become a business in its own right. The original decision to build its own cabinets had expanded the company substantially and produced a furniture division operating under the name Dealcraft. Cabinetry sold on its own account and supplied to the audio and television lines from inside the same organization. Very few electronics manufacturers anywhere owned their own furniture brand. Electrohome had arrived at one by accident 40 years earlier because a phonograph needed a box. At the center of the audio catalog sat the console stereo. The term now needs explaining. A console stereo was a complete system: turntable, amplifier, radio tuner, and loudspeakers, assembled inside a single cabinet and sold as one object. In a Canadian living room in 1965, it was not a component of a music system. It was the music system. It was also the sideboard. What went inside them was, by the standards of the period, substantially the company's own. The 1960s catalog lists loudspeakers and high-fidelity tube amplifiers as Electrohome products in their own right, not simply as parts buried inside a cabinet. A company that could design the amplifier, build the speakers, cut and finish the cabinet, and sell the finished object through its own dealers was doing very nearly the whole job in-house. And doing it from a single city in southwestern Ontario, in a market a fraction the size of the one its American competitors sold into. And one property of that arrangement is worth setting down here, plainly, without comment. In a console stereo, the two loudspeakers are exactly as far apart as the cabinet is wide, not 1 inch further. No one in 1965 experienced that as a limitation. Stereo was still new enough in most Canadian homes that having 2 channels at all was the novelty, and a cabinet the width of a sideboard seemed like an enormous amount of room to spread them across. The physics would assert itself later, and when it did, it would not be negotiable. For most of the 1960s, that was not a problem. It was the product. And the company was about to build the most ambitious version of it that anyone in Canada would attempt. The scale of what Electrohome had become by the end of the 1960s is easy to underestimate from a distance, so it is worth setting the numbers down in one place. By 1965, its products were being sold in 23 countries. Total sales in 1968 came to $44.5 million. Across its operating life, the company ran 10 manufacturing plants and 2 administrative offices in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. At its height, it employed more than 4,000 people across nearly 1.6 million square feet of factory and service space in Kitchener-Waterloo and Cambridge, supported by sales offices through North America and into Europe. By the end of the decade, it was the second largest employer in Kitchener-Waterloo, behind only the Dominion Rubber Company. Set that against the place it happened in. This was not Toronto, and it was not Montreal. This was a manufacturing region in southwestern Ontario building consumer electronics for export out of 10 separate plants, in a country whose entire domestic market was a fraction of the one its American competitors sold into. A payroll of 4,000 in a region that size is not a line in an annual report. It is the kind of employer a mid-sized Canadian city organizes itself around. And the company was profitable enough and confident enough to spend part of that on building something that did not have to exist at all. Gordon Duern, Electrohome's design director, looked to the Canadian government's space program when he set out to design it. Dealer and museum records place the first-round prototype at around 1965 or 1966. It combined a solid-state stereo and its controls inside a teak cabinet, a wall-mounted television screen, and a chair with loudspeakers built into the wings and controls set into the armrests. The production version reached the market in 1967 under the name Circa 75, and it was a featured product of the Electrohome exhibit at Expo 67 in Montreal. Model records describe components set into a roll-top teak cabinet built under the Dealcraft name, carried on a cantilevered aluminum base, with speakers inset on either side, AM/FM stereo, a dual turntable, and a headphone jack mounted underneath. Roll the top back, and the controls were laid out across the face like an aircraft dashboard. Duern was not designing a stereo. Accounts of his intention described the Circa 75 as a communications center, a machine that would track the New York Stock Exchange, link the household with distant cities and universities, and let the owner shop from a favorite store without leaving the room. That was 1967. Every one of those functions arrived eventually. Not one of them arrived within 25 years of the announcement, and none of them arrived in a cabinet. One surviving receipt records a Circa 75 Model 703 sold for $625 in 1970. That was a considerable sum for a household object at the time, and the object it bought was, unmistakably, furniture. There is one further detail in the Circa 75 that very few people notice, and it is the most important technical fact in this entire account. Owners' accounts of the system describe it as requiring its matching satellite speakers to be used at all, because the loudspeaker built into the body of the unit was essentially a bass driver, functioning, in effect, as an early subwoofer. The stereo image did not come from the cabinet. It came from 2 small speakers placed out in the room, away from it. Read that slowly because of what it means. Electrohome knew. In 1967 in Kitchener, this company understood perfectly well that a single piece of furniture could not produce a stereo image, and it had arrived at the correct engineering answer: put the bass in the cabinet and put the stereo out in the room. That is a satellite and subwoofer arrangement, described here decades before the industry settled on the vocabulary for it. The company had the answer. It simply kept selling it bolted to a sideboard. The satellites were accessories to the teak. The teak was never an accessory to the satellites, nor was that the end of the space-age line. In 1970, the year after the first moon landing, the company launched a further series of stereo combinations and record players under the name Apollo, bubble-topped, aluminum-stemmed, and like everything before them, sold as objects to be looked at as much as listened to. Through all of it, the underlying logic held. Whatever else changed. The tubes, the transistors, the styling, the finish. The thing being sold was a piece of furniture with sound inside it. That had been true since 1907. It was still true in 1970. It was the single continuous idea running through 6 decades of a Canadian manufacturer, and by every commercial measure available at the time, it was working. The company had found the right answer about loudspeakers and filed it under accessories. In 1972, John A. Pollock, grandson of the founder, became the third generation of the family to lead the company. By then, Electrohome was widely described as the Canadian equivalent of an American giant like General Electric or RCA, a comparison that flattered the company and described the country accurately at the same time. Under his direction, the firm pushed outward into a run of ventures, consumer and industrial at the same time. Specialized data displays built for the New York Stock Exchange, large-screen projection televisions, reverse osmosis and ultrafiltration systems, which had nothing to do with sound or pictures at all. Custom monitors supplied through the late 1970s and into the 1980s to leading video game manufacturers, Atari and Sega among them. There were shorter ventures as well, into satellite television receivers and into Videotex hardware, and neither lasted. Something in that list is easy to read past. Every one of those customers bought on specification. A stock exchange ordering data displays, a game manufacturer ordering monitors by the thousand. None of them cared what the enclosure looked like because in most cases, nobody would ever stand back and look at it. For the first time since 1907, Electrohome was selling products in which the cabinet did not matter, which makes one item on that list worth returning to. In 1967, Gordon Duern had sketched a machine for the Canadian living room that would, among other things, track the New York Stock Exchange. Within about a decade, the company was in fact building screens that tracked the New York Stock Exchange. They were not set in teak. They were not standing in Ontario front rooms. They were not for households at all. They were for the exchange. Then there were the arcades. By the end of the 1970s, Electrohome monitors were sitting inside coin-operated cabinets across North America, and the distinction that governed that business was between two ways of drawing a picture. A raster monitor sweeps its beam across the screen in horizontal lines, top to bottom, the way a television does, and assembles the image out of those lines. A vector monitor ignores lines altogether and draws straight strokes between plotted points, which is why the games built around one look like wireframe. Electrohome supplied both, the G05 and the G08 for vector work, and the G07, a 19-inch red-green-blue color raster monitor for everything else. Where the G07 came from is part of the story, too. Accounts from former staff and from collectors suggest that Electrohome's arcade chassis were, in essence, television chassis. Sourced designs with the tuner and intermediate frequency section stripped out so the monitor could accept a red, green, and blue signal directly. The company had spent 30 years building television sets. When the arcade business arrived, it reached for what was already on the bench. The service and operation manuals shipped with the hardware, carrying the company's full identification: Electrohome Electronics, a division of Central Ontario Television Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of Electrohome Limited. And on the page that told an operator where to order parts, an address in Kitchener, 80NT now A9 Wellington Street North. Any operator on the continent with a dead monitor and a soldering iron could write there. The company's screens were now in arcades and on trading floors, in numbers no console stereo had ever reached. They were disappearing from one place only, and the reason had nothing to do with Japan. The answer Electrohome had filed under accessories did not stay filed. Over the course of the 1970s, the industry took it out, looked at it properly, and rebuilt the living room around it. The principle can be stated in a sentence. Two loudspeakers produce a stereo image by sitting far enough apart that the listener hears the difference between them, And the wider that spacing within limits, the wider and more convincing the space between them becomes. A cabinet cannot supply it. However well made it is, however finely finished, a single box holds its two speakers a fixed distance from each other, and that distance is the width of a piece of furniture. So the box came apart. Accounts of the period describe the need for adequate separation, pushing single cabinet designs toward three-box arrangements, with the main unit shrinking sharply once it no longer had to carry the speakers, and describe systems from the beginning of the 1970s increasingly built out of plastic and other materials rather than wood. The component system replaced the console. In place of one object, a stack of separate units each doing a single job: receiver, turntable, tape deck, and the speakers carried out into the room and set down wherever they sounded best. Everything in that sentence was bad news for Kitchener. It was not that Electrohome could not build a receiver. It had been building them since before the war. It was that the industry had just deleted the one part of the job the company did better than nearly anyone in the country. 63 years of accumulated skill sat in the finishing of hardwood, and hardwood had stopped being a selling point at exactly the moment a stereo system stopped being something a household looked at. Nobody was buying a shape for the front room anymore. They were buying a signal path. The retail arithmetic changed with it. A console was bought once, entire, on a single afternoon. Components were bought one at a time, then upgraded one at a time, which suited the customer and suited the specialist dealer and suited nobody at all who had built a business on selling the whole room in one delivery. Into that new market came the imports, the competition arriving through the 1970s and into the 1980s from Sony and the other Japanese manufacturers is usually presented as the cause of what followed. It is better understood as the second blow, landing on a company already standing in the wrong place. Available accounts describe fierce competition from Japanese electronics firms selling on lower cost and high quality. Financial strain compounded by currency movements and shifting trade policy and labor disputes as the company restructured and cost-cutting met job security head-on. There is one further detail, and it needs handling carefully, because the sourcing for it is collector recollection rather than corporate record. Accounts from former staff and from collectors suggest that from the middle of the 1970s until about 1982, the television chassis behind a number of Electrohome sets were manufactured by JVC, with the company rebadging and assembling them in Kitchener. If that is accurate, it was in no way disgraceful. Sourcing chassis from a specialist and building the product around it was ordinary industry practice on both sides of the border, and it kept Canadian assembly lines running that would otherwise have stopped years earlier. But it points at something uncomfortable. By the early 1980s, the reliably Canadian portion of an Electrohome television was the cabinet, the design, the assembly, and the name. And the cabinet was the part the market had just finished discarding. In 1984, the company stopped making television sets. It licensed the brand name to Mitsubishi Electric instead, and from that year until 1999, the sets, carrying the Electrohome name on their fronts, were produced under license by a Japanese manufacturer. Around the same time, the plants began to close, the main Kitchener facilities among them in 1984, and consumer product manufacturing ended by 1987. The published dates do not fully agree. Some records still describe the company as Canada's largest television manufacturer through to 1987. So the safe statement is the narrow one. Set production ended in the middle of the decade. What is not in dispute is the human arithmetic. The closures culminated in major layoffs across the late 1980s, in a region where this company had been the second largest employer inside living memory. It is worth being precise about what that 1984 license did and did not do, because it is the hinge of this entire account, and it is routinely overstated. It did not end the company. Electrohome went on manufacturing under its own name, in its own plants, in Kitchener, for another 15 years. It did not end Canadian production. The monitors, the displays, and the projectors were still being built in Ontario by Ontario staff, and the best years of that business were still ahead of it. What it ended was smaller and more specific and worse. From 1984 onward, a television set with Electrohome written across the front had been designed and built by a corporation in Japan. The name and the maker were now two different companies. For 77 years, those 6 letters had meant a firm in Kitchener that made the thing you were looking at. From that year forward, on the one product that had carried the name into more Canadian homes than any other, it meant a contract. The word had begun doing a different job. Nobody announced it. What the company kept was, on paper, the better half of it. By the end of the 1980s, Electrohome had withdrawn completely from the manufacture of consumer products and concentrated on the 2 segments that remained: broadcasting and commercial data, video and graphics display, and projection. The broadcasting side had been assembled slowly and mostly out of sight. The Kitchener station the company had helped launch in 1954 came under its full control in 1970, when Canadian rules substantially reduced foreign ownership of media, and the cinema chain holding the other half, controlled from Hollywood, had to step back. A second station followed in Edmonton in 1988. In 1995, Electrohome entered a partnership with Batten Broadcasting covering stations in Kitchener, Edmonton, Calgary, London, Wheatley, and Wingham. The following year, the partnership was reorganized. Batten took full ownership of all of them, and with them the controlling interest in CTV. In return, Electrohome received cash and shares worth 270 million Canadian dollars. A company that had been laying off television assemblers a few years earlier had just sold a television network. The other half of what remained had been built in a laboratory rather than bought at a broadcast hearing. Electrohome Projection Systems was established in 1979 and headquartered in Kitchener, and it specialized in large-screen video, data, and graphics display, the equipment that puts an image on a wall rather than in a box. The line evolved across 2 decades, from single-tube monochrome data projectors through stereoscopic systems and onto digital cinema projectors built around Texas Instruments' digital light processing technology. By 1999, the division had more than 20,000 projectors installed in over 40 countries, and its own chairman described it as one of the largest and most successful parts of the business for more than a decade. This was not a company dying. It was a company that had changed jobs, and by most available measures, it was doing the new one rather better than the old. Then, over the course of 9 years, it sold every part of that. August 1999. Christie Incorporated agrees to buy the projection division. The 1st of November, 1999. The shareholders approve. The division becomes Christie Digital Systems. The staff stay, the engineering stays, the Kitchener plant stays. The name over the door does not. Also, 1999. The television license changes hands. Mitsubishi out. A Canadian distributor in, putting the Electrohome name on televisions and DVD players. The last manufacturing plant and the head office on Wellington Street North are sold to Christie Digital Systems. 2007 into 2008. The trademarks go. They change hands more than once before they settle. The shares are canceled and delisted late 2008. An orderly windup begins. Read in a list like that. The sequence looks like a collapse. It was not, quite. Each of those transactions was orderly, negotiated, and, for the shareholders, profitable. Nothing was seized. Nothing went under. The projection division did not fail. It was sold at the top of its form to a buyer who wanted precisely what it was good at. The company did not run out of money. It ran out of reasons to be a company. There is a pattern in the order of the sales, and it is worth naming. Each transaction converted something the company could do into money. The stations went, and with them the ability to broadcast. The projection division went, and with it the ability to design and build. The plant on Wellington Street went, and with it the ability to manufacture anything at all. By 2007, the only asset that had not been converted was the one asset that had never required a factory to maintain. A corporation had spent a century learning how to make things, and finished by discovering that the most durable thing it had ever produced was a word. John Pollock, by then the last of 3 generations to run the firm, did the arithmetic himself in an interview as the windup began. In the early 1980s, he said, the company had 7 operating divisions and 4,300 people. At the end, there were 3 employees. The manufacturing businesses had all moved offshore. The broadcasting had been consolidated into larger hands late in the 1990s. He described what remained as a faint shadow of the firm it had been. 3 employees is a strange number to end on because it is not 0. Somebody was still coming in. What those last few people were doing was not commercial. There were no products left to discontinue and no orders left to fill. There were obligations, pensions, and benefits owed to former employees, and the cleanup of a contaminated property in Kitchener where the company's metal products operation had once stood. Roughly 0.8 of a hectare of ground. Once it was clean, it would be sold. There is something almost exact in that. The Pollock Company had begun by buying a woodworking plant in Elmira so it could build cabinets. It finished a century later by cleaning the soil under a Kitchener yard so somebody else could build something there. In between, it had put phonographs, radios, televisions, stereo consoles, tube amplifiers, arcade monitors, stock exchange displays, and cinema projectors into the world. The last industrial task on the list was making a piece of Ontario safe to hand over. The windup ran its course, and the corporation that had carried the name for 101 years stopped existing. The name did not. It had already left the building. When the ledger finally closed, one asset had outlived every plant number, every payroll, and every product line. It was 6 letters long, and it was for sale. In February 2010, a little over a year after the windup began, the Electrohome brand was acquired by the Bluetronics Group, a division of Circus World Displays Limited. The lot included rights to several other names: Magnasonic, SecureGuard, and, for Canada only, Citizen. The buyer operates out of Niagara Falls, Ontario, and its stable of brands also includes Fluence, a Canadian audio company with a following of its own. The name did not leave the province. It traveled from one end of southern Ontario to the other, and it went back to work. What it does now is a matter of public record. The Montrose RR36 is a belt-driven record player with Bluetooth and a USB-A port for copying a record straight onto a storage device. It lists at roughly $120 American. The matching McKinley-powered speakers list at about $100. Both are finished in vinyl wrap over wood. Both have been reviewed, on their merits, in the hi-fi press. The brand presents itself accordingly. Its own pages describe a retro line of record players backed by more than a century of high-fidelity audio, and they still tell the story of the coin. The one Arthur Bell Pollock is said to have flipped in front of his wife in 1907. Heads for phonographs in Kitchener. Tails for real estate out west. None of that is false. The century happened. The coin is the same coin. What has changed is what stands behind the sentence. The company those words describe stopped existing in 2008. The words themselves are now the property of a different firm in a different city, acquired legally and put back to work. The other half of the company traveled in the opposite direction, and the direction matters. By Christie's own account, the sequence ran like this. It was the first company to license digital light processing from Texas Instruments, and it then arranged to acquire Electrohome, a well-known Canadian manufacturer of televisions and projection systems with extensive experience in that technology. Kitchener did not hand Christie the technology. Christie already had the license. What it went to Kitchener for was the people who knew how to build machines around it. That continuity was not automatic. When the projection division changed hands in 1999, the terms provided for the existing staff, the manufacturing facilities, the engineering and the administrative offices in Kitchener to be kept in place, Oism, Electrohome, along with sales and service locations around the world. In this case, the working knowledge stayed in the city where it had been assembled. Christie today is a visual technologies company built around digital projection, headquartered in California, with its engineering carried out in Kitchener, Ontario. The projectors that light cinema screens and public buildings in a good many countries are engineered in the city where the phonograph cabinets were built. So the company was not destroyed, it was divided, and the division was clean. The name went to Niagara Falls. The knowledge stayed in Kitchener. Both halves are still working under different owners, on different products, for different customers. Nothing connects them now except a word and a city. Some of it did survive in the region in a form that can be looked at. As the company was closing, John Pollock described giving roughly 400 historical pieces to a museum then being built in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, and museum and collector records placed the original round circa 75 prototype in the regional collection. The rest of the survivors are in private hands. Console stereos in teak and other hardwood still come up for sale in Ontario, restored and rewired, priced now as furniture again, which is what they were sold as in the first place. Which returns this account to 1933 and to the thing the word was invented to do. Electrohome was not created as the name of a manufacturer. It was created as a merchandising label, electric and home, for a company organized into 3 divisions, 2 of which had nothing to do with electronics, and it went onto space heaters and food mixers as readily as onto anything that made a sound. It was designed from the outset to be applied to household goods. It is now applied to household goods. The circle is closed. That is not a fall. A label cannot fall. It can only be applied to something else. What was lost is a meaning the trademark never contained in the first place. For roughly 50 years, from the first hardwood console televisions to the last projectors built under the company's own name, those 6 letters also meant a place, a payroll in Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, and an object in a Canadian living room that had been designed, cased, wired, and finished by people who lived within driving distance of it. That meaning was never registered. It could not be sold with the trademark, and it could not be bought back with it either. In the service manuals printed for those arcade monitors in 1980, on the page that told an operator where to order parts, there is an address, 809 Wellington Street North, Kitchener, Ontario. The building that address belongs to was sold in 2004 to Christie Digital Systems. The street is right. The number is right. The city is right. The name on the door is not.